and how you can do your part to advocate for loss and damage measures and share your lessons learned with your community. So our objectives for today, next slide, please. Thank you. Are pretty straightforward, understanding loss and damage, both as a concept and its relationship with the UNFCCC, highlighting how loss and damage is related to climate justice, and providing you with the tools to discuss loss and damage with your peers and community. And lastly, a bit of self-promotion, shameless self-promotion of the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, what our work is and how you can contribute in trying to foster a global movement for loss and damage. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, yeah, this is an odd slide. So in order to discuss loss and damage, we must first acknowledge the global effects of climate change, so both in the present and the future. In this sense, it's important to note that loss and damage, is happening now, and it's getting worse. So if you can just click again, please, Sadie. I just lost the screen. Awesome. So the first slide was showing the increasing temperatures over time. The last 5 years have been the hottest 5 years ever on record, which is phenomenal. Here we see that freshwater flows are shifting, gradually moving north or to less arid regions, which will stress a lot of societies as the Earth heats up. Next picture, please. Here you also see a change in agricultural yields. Some nations will actually benefit from climate change in this very specific instance, in that they will be more productive agriculturally speaking, but many more nations will be suffering from droughts and potential famines due to decreased soil capacity and less moisture in the air. And lastly, one of the more famous examples is the retreat of Arctic ice, especially with the Greenland ice sheet, as the ice melts, and reduced albedo effect just perpetually heats up the atmosphere, which is pretty bleak. So this presentation will be a little bleak to start off, but hopefully we'll transition to a more hopeful note as we go into the more action-based part. So it has been noted that we have seen a 1.2 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures above pre-industrial averages since the Industrial Revolution. And the 2020 World Disasters Report notes that the number of climate and weather-related disasters has been increasing since the 1960s and has risen by almost a third since the 1990s, which is phenomenal. So a bit under 500,000 people have been killed by climate events in the last 10 years, and this number is expected to only increase as time goes on. So next slide, please. So what is loss and damage? What is this nebulous term we keep throwing around without clarifying truly? I'm going to take just a minute here. Oh, sorry, if we can just, thank you. Just a minute here to ask you, it's all good, to put in the chat how you would define loss and damage if your friends overheard you talking about L&D and needed a quick summary. What keywords would you use? And then we'll compare and contrast with the definition we're working with, which isn't the final definition. It's an ongoing process, but I'm sure we'll find a lot of common points. So yeah, just in the chat, I'll give you 20 seconds. Yeah. Loss of assets due to extreme weather events, that's definitely part of it. Yeah. Loss, negative impacts. Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. Yeah, so there's obviously a common trend here, which is loss, obviously, and negative impacts, as well as climate change. So all of these definitions. Oh, thank you. Okay, more incoming. Awesome. Exactly. Social and economic and environmental impacts. So it's not just an environmental issue. It is a intersectional problem. And disproportionate impacts. Yes, disproportionate comes back to the idea of climate justice, and that most of the world is suffering for effects that they have very little to do with initially and ongoing. So next slide, please. So for our definition, very simply, it's a little technical, we define loss and damage as the residual costs of climate change that have not been avoided through mitigation and adaptation. So to give you a bit of background, Loss and damage has its origins in the small island developing states at the UN calling for compensation for climate change impacts, especially sea level rise, as they will lose more territory and sovereignty and threaten ultimately their existence. The definition is characterized as a highly political and contentious debate between developed and developing countries, which makes it somewhat hard to define. However, the definition we have here on the slide is an acceptable assessment of loss damage as it covers the broad strokes of LND. For those who are not necessarily as familiar with the terms on the slide, mitigation refers to the set of actions taken to limit climate change and its related effects, usually by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And adaptation involves the process of adjusting to current or expected climate change effects. So mitigation and adaptation are complementary and not oppositional. And unfortunately, when mitigation and or adaptation are insufficient, loss and damage can occur. Next slide, please. So the concepts of loss and damage within one concept. These words are related, but they are distinctly different. So one researcher, Salamia Hook, has defined loss as things that are lost forever and cannot be brought back. On the other hand, you have damage, which refers to things that are damaged but can be repaired or restored, such as roads or embankments. Next slide, please. So to continue the definition, loss and damage can be both economic, in that it includes the loss of property or the degradation of property, assets, infrastructure, agricultural production, or revenue. Or it can also be non-economic, which includes the loss of life or degraded health, reduced human mobility, the degradation of territory, cultural heritage, indigenous knowledge, biodiversity, and ecosystem services, which is quite broad. But it is important to understand that loss and damage encapsulates essentially everything. And that's what makes it such an important issue. It's not just a anthropocentric concept, it's the biosystem as a whole. So next slide, please. Thank you. So you have two different types of loss and damage hazards. These can manifest themselves either as immediate or extreme events. So this can include hurricanes, floods, heat waves, or droughts, and many others. Or these can be more slow onset events, less obvious in the short term, but with dramatic consequences in the long term. So this would include sea level rise, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, and desertification. I should also note the distinction between a risk and a hazard. So a hazard is something that can cause a harm, and a risk is the chance of this harm actually occurring against someone. So the hazards of climate change already exist. The ocean is a hazard. It can create a lot of devastation, but climate change exacerbates this hazard, becoming a risk. So this is what climate change is all about in relation to loss and damage. It amplifies risks of natural disasters and other loss and damage phenomena. So next slide, please. So to give you a couple of examples of immediate loss of damage, all of these pictures unfortunately come from 2021, so very recent. On the left, the cyclones, we have Cyclone Eloise in Mozambique, which was in January. Then we have the Californian wildfires, which were, well, they've been ongoing for a while, but this picture is from January as well. And in India, we had a glacier burst last month. And all of these impacts have had devastating consequences for communities, for their livelihoods, lives, and just cultural heritage. Moving on, please, to slow onset loss and damage. So this is a little less appealing to the media because it's not as obvious. I mean, the pictures aren't necessarily as interesting, although they are just as striking, frankly. So on the left, you have desertification, which is the degradation of drylands. This usually just kills local ecosystems or biological productivity, and the deserts are expanding. So here we see desertification, the Red Sea Governorate in Egypt. In the middle, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and how it's dying out. It's being bleached. The ocean is absorbing carbon emission, CO2, and that makes the water acid, killing a lot of animals and their skeletons. And then we have sea level rise. So sea level rise is a little more of an intricate consequence of climate change as a loss and damage. It's not just a uniform rise of water across the globe. There are a lot of disparities in the Arctic, for instance. The sea level will drop, surprisingly. And in other places, it could rise to up to 6 meters, depending on the current emission scenarios we're following. And some places actually up to 10 meters, which is pretty terrifying. I'm currently in the Netherlands, so 1 meter rise is pretty much an existential crisis. So next slide, please. A couple of examples to really demonstrate the impact of loss and damage. So in 2019 in Mozambique, 2 cyclones occurred within 2 months, which is phenomenal frequency, though unfortunately not unprecedented and will only be multiplying with time. This left 2 million people impacted with severe food insecurity and killed approximately 600 people and included 1,600 injured individuals. 100,000 people were displaced across 73 resettlement sites, and half of these were children. As of 2 years later, as of January 2021, half of these people are still living in these emergency shelters, which were not designed to be lived in this long and very unsustainably. And unfortunately, these living conditions have also led to cholera outbreaks and healthcare deficiencies, as well as food deficiencies. And in an incredibly bad luck, stroke of luck, Cyclone Eloise hit in January 2021, which just only exacerbates the current situation. Next slide, please. So this was 2019, now we're in 2020. Well, we were in 2020 until a few months ago. And 2020, for many reasons, was a terrible year, especially for the climate. So it has come close as one of the hottest years ever recorded in human history. The Atlantic hurricane season was the most active on record, with over 30 recorded storms. And the Philippines especially was hit by a series of super typhoons, which still has dramatic consequences today for hundreds of thousands of people. Australia, I'm sure you all remember the coverage, was on fire pretty much due to grassland fires. And floods and landslides have pushed over 12 million people out of their homes in India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. So these are all examples of loss and damage occurring today that will only be amplified as climate change exacerbates current imbalances in the environment. So now I shall leave it to the next slide for Ineza.
No, it's me.
Oh, sorry, apologies. Yeah,
that's okay. Thank you, Nicola. I really appreciated that thorough background. So I'm going to talk a bit about loss and damage politics, finance, and how it relates to climate justice. Starting with how loss and damage is dealt with on the ground. Just for background, most loss and damage is dealt with through humanitarian assistance and the support of governments. So, for example, agencies like the Red Cross and Red Crescent will get an alert for a disaster, and then they will deploy their teams to help provide food and shelter support to people. There are a number of issues with this. The first being that the system is underfunded and not well enough equipped to actually meet the full need of people experiencing loss and damage. And secondly, because it tends to be really focused on response rather than prevention of disasters. So essentially, it's a lot easier to get resources to people before a disaster happens than after, because fairly evidently the infrastructure is damaged, and try getting food supplies to every house when the streets are flooded or when the power's down. Like these are major challenges. And the other place that loss and damage can be dealt with on the ground is through adaptation. So there are some adaptation projects which include aspects such as early warning systems, which are like essentially alert systems that link weather forecasts to actions that people should take. So an early warning system might tell people to go evacuate, and might tell people to harvest their crops a week early before a disaster is going to hit. And so those things do kind of exist in climate change adaptation programming already, but kind of on a pretty small scale, and certainly not at the scale of the need for loss and damage. So I often call loss and damage the biggest climate justice issue that you've never heard of. I think a lot of people do talk about the impacts of climate change. They just don't necessarily call it loss and damage. But the reason that it's important to call it loss and damage is because within the UN climate change negotiations, that's what it's referred to. And the reason that's important is because the UN climate negotiations is the one international body that has almost every country signed on, and that has like a direct mandate to deal with this as an issue related to climate change. So the policy decisions that happen there are really important for what happens on the ground. And yet you kind of see on the left there this picture of, here's the people who are negotiating what's happening, and on the right we see the people who are dealing with the effects of climate change. And, I think a lot of the time the people most affected aren't in the room, and the people who have the most power within the negotiations are people who are essentially part of the global class of elite people that are making decisions on behalf of many, many people in the world. And here's a GIF or a GIF, if you will, of colonialism throughout the years. So maybe just take a second to actually look at it. Here, starting from the beginning, you can see the beginnings of some European colonies, and then into the 1800s and 1900s, we see like the colonial, particularly France, England, some other European countries, and then the United States as well. I wanted to point this out because it's one of the underlying factors that leads to the global inequality and injustice that we see now in climate change, colonialism and associated exploitative economic activity, really stealing resources and labor from countries around the world to enrich countries in the global north is the foundation of why we have such an unequal world and why the impacts of climate change are so unequally distributed. And the other thing I wanted to say was that often those people who are most affected by the impacts of climate change and loss and damage are the people who did the least to cause it. And they're people, people, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, on average, emit very little carbon dioxide, and yet it's an extremely vulnerable region compared to Europe, where we emit more and relatively experience lesser impacts. And within the climate politics policy regime, Europe and North America have outsized power to influence, and that also comes with the fact that they have more wealth than the other countries, and the other countries are indebted to international institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And with that, I'm going to go into the politics of loss and damage within the UN climate negotiations. So loss and damage is governed within the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, which is a body that was established within the UN climate negotiations in 2013. Its mandate is to address loss and damage associated with the impacts of climate change. And it has three functions, which are kind of like around knowledge and understanding, around coordination and dialogue between countries. And then the last one is more about that actual action and support, which includes finance for loss and damage, as well as technology and building the capacity of nations and people to better address loss and damage. Loss and damage is Article 8 of the Paris Agreement. which and so it has its own little clause, it has its own article of the International Climate Treaty, which mandates countries to enhance understanding, action, and support on loss and damage. Here's the first recorded mention of loss and damage in the UN climate change document, as Nicola mentioned, brought about by the small island developing nations. This is from 1991, to give you a picture of the fact that we were already talking about this 30 years ago and still nothing's happened. It's in some negotiating text, but it says the financial burden of loss and damage suffered by vulnerable islands facing sea level rise should be distributed in equal manner amongst industrialized nations. In terms of the finance that the financial estimates for how much loss and damage costs, there's like a number of studies on this. Obviously, it will always be an estimate, but the estimated cost in 2020 was $100 to $400 billion US. Some studies estimate by 2030 it will be $300 to $600 billion per year, and that by 2050 this will climb to $1 to $2 trillion per year. So these are enormous damage estimates. This is like the size of the GDP of some medium nations, and often, I know there's an example of Vanuatu with one of its more severe cyclones losing like more than 100% of its GDP in a year. In terms of the available finance to actually pay for this, so the designated loss and damage funds from the International Climate Negotiations Framework is $0. There's no international framework to pay for loss and damage. Specifically, funds from humanitarian aid, adaptation, and development spending obviously do overlap with loss and damage, of course. We don't have a good estimate of how much it costs, but I think it's safe to say it's underfunded because even for adaptation, for example, the goal of $100 billion annually hasn't been, with 50% going to adaptation, so 50 billion annually hasn't been properly met. A lot of countries will take the climate finance or finance they've spent on other things such as development and relabel it as climate finance. There's a lack of transparency on this issue. And in the end of the day, like the bulk of the costs of loss and damage are borne by the people who experience it. So essentially, the people who are facing loss and damage pay for it out of their pockets. And secondarily, the governments who are absolutely devastated by the disasters are also paying for it out of pocket. And so on the asks of developing countries on loss and damage, the first is finance to address loss and damage. I mean, that's pretty clear. It would go a long way. Developing countries have also asked the Warsaw International Mechanism, this loss and damage governance body, to work with the Standing Committee on Finance to figure out how finance can happen, which is another, Standing Committee on Finance is another UN negotiations body. They want the WIM to work with the Green Climate Fund, which is a major climate fund that channels money from developed countries to developing countries. They have established a new expert group on action and support, which is kind of the stream of the WIM's work that is focused on actual tangible action. And there's this new thing called the Santiago Network, which is essentially, as we understand it, is going to be a new technical network of people that can help provide practical solutions for loss and damage on the ground. We don't know exactly what this will look like. It's going to be established this year, but essentially How I see it is potentially a network where all of the institutions that are working on loss and damage in each country can come together, share their knowledge, coordinate, and then also come up with a specific ask for how much finance they would need in a given year, and hopefully be able to channel that finance. In terms of developed country positions on loss and damage, there is a spectrum of views. And if I didn't come down with a bad cold, I would have added in a graphic about how some countries view loss and damage as kind of just what's at the limit of kind of adaptation. So they'd say like, oh, this is really similar to adaptation. It should be addressed through adaptation funds. And then on the far end, there I guess are countries that see it as an existential threat. I don't think any developed countries like take that view in the negotiations. I think that's more of a position from developing countries, for example, small island developing states. But in general, I would say that developed countries are not cooperative with the demands of developing countries to provide finance. I think the main reason is that it would be very expensive and they don't want to take responsibility and liability for that much money. And yeah, but I think it does constitute a certain kind of climate denial, to be honest, if countries say that they care about addressing climate change and they're not willing to cooperate to actively address it. A lot of countries have said they want to take stock of what finance already exists before they provide anything new. They want to look at what's already happening, and we can show how to enhance the use of those resources. It's a whole load of bull. Anyway, reminder to self: don't use that word in future presentations. Okay. So yeah, with that, thank you for listening, and I will pass on to Ineza, who's going to present the last section of this presentation.
Thank you. Wait, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my mic can be a little bit so miraculous, and I can be talking and then my voice not passing through. So thank you Sadie and Nicola for like a very cool background of like creating the path of what I'm going to say. And I know we heard so much about the loss and damage. I believe that now we know what is a little bit what is loss and damage. I'm going to be talking on how we are going to drive into how we're going to drive into action by taking into consideration what is already happening, and also what is our collective vision for the future. Next slide, please. So as we heard, there's a lot of that need to be done in terms of climate justice all over the world. For the past few years, loss and damage has been a major topic in the climate negotiation, but yet an ignored topic for some partners. For me, I use like the word partners because I believe that because we all share the same planet, to be good to be picturing ourselves as partners. So what have been happening in the past is like vulnerable countries have a set of priority that they want to push forward in order to address the climate impact in their region. But the other side of developed country, they don't want to take responsibilities. As my colleague said, expressed, they're like, there's no, I don't know how to say that, it's kind of, there's no political willingness, or there's a lack of empathy. It's a very, how can I say, it's a very hard topic because it can make you feel a bit more unseen, invisible, anything. But I believe that we are on the good track. As we have been said, we have the WIM that was designed in 213. Although it is a policy-wise good initiative, but yet there's no financial mechanism arm associated with it, which make it very impossible to see some concrete action or response mechanism on the ground. And these make the number of vulnerable countries, vulnerable community being increasingly high. And since as the COVID showcased that the fact COVID was a good example. I don't want to say that COVID was good, but yet it was a good experience to really showcase the reality of inequality that exists around the world, not only in climate but also in the economy. So the gap is really prominent. And in 2019, during the COP25, that was the first discussion about establishing the Santiago network. So the purpose was to create a window aiming to support a vulnerable country to respond to their climate crisis. And though it will be the current discussion that's going forward is to see how it can be operating in a similar way as the CTCN, which is like another arm of the UNFCCC. So basically, it's like the Santiago network can be like an existing arm to support vulnerable country in an immediate, responsive manner, but also permitting sustainable change, if I can put it that way. So the implementation, the Warsaw mechanism currently is being in the guidance of the executive committee under the conference of parties. So basically all the countries around the world come together and then decide how the women gonna be operating, what is the priority. But most of the cases is like the vulnerable countries put forward what they need or what they expect to see. As have been pointed out, the loss and damage came into the discussion in 1991. So it's a long process. So if it doesn't feel right to be still talking at this be still talking the same point, using the same example, using the same hope, but yet no action. So what is happening is that there's inequality of voices in the on the decision-making table. And so why there's a need to advocate for a specific need or prioritizing of the loss and damage discussion in the negotiation. Next slide, please. So during the COP26, which is like the biggest COP, I wasn't there for the Paris Agreement. People say like the Paris Agreement was the big COP. So, but for me, I think that the COP26 will be the like a major COP, not only because we have like a more hope built up in terms of climate justice, but also we aim to, our hope is like to have the Santiago network loss and damage being established. So they'll be operational in a way that we the community, we want to see it happening on the ground. And also we want to see a new finance window for loss and damage being established. As have been said in the past few slides, it is really, when you see the amount of money that the countries are putting forward to address the climate impact, loss and damage, and yet you find in the bank, if I can say, the bank, there's no even a single dollar to really help the country to respond or to cope. And yet we are talking about sustainable development, equality in the economy. So there's a lot of how can I say, there's a lot of voids in ensuring that we are delivering our promises to the next generation. So next slide, please. So our vision for the future is simply, we want to be honoring the right for the future for our next generation by maximizing our global action. So we need to avoid the extent of loss and damage impact by effectively doing adaptation and mitigation mechanism, by meeting the basic need of each country in addressing the climate challenges, also increasing the accountability for developed country to really take responsibility and then admit that we all need to be, we are on the same boat because we have like the same planet. So if my part is sinking, so your part too will be sinking, maybe because there's inequality in terms of power. Maybe I will sink first, but definitely you will sink too in the near future. So it's because we are together, and also we want also to bring to compensate and repair the affected community. Next, please. So Also, at the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, we want to bring a collective approach. We want to bring the untold tales of loss and damage impact to the fore through storytelling and blogging. So giving the opportunity for the community, excuse, giving the voice, the opportunity to the community to express themselves. We want to, excuse me. Sorry. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So also we want to maximize the voice of the need for the global community through advocacy on the national and international level. So it's like we want to collect the priority point for the country. Then we do it this in form of open letters. We did one for the UK and one for the USA, which is going forward. We also want to train a mass of young experts through capacity building and training. So like this one.
Ineza, do you want me to jump in for like one slide and you can cough and drink some water?
Please.
Okay, cool. So yeah, as Ineza was saying, that's the worst when you trying to speak well, suppressing a cough. Anyway, so yeah, we're training young people. This is actually our first Loss and Damage 101 training to better understand the issue and spread the message. So yeah, and our demands. So these are pulled from our letter that we recently wrote to the U.S. Government in our open letter on loss and damage, which you can sign. We'll put some links in the chat. So our demands are to prioritize action, honor the rights of the future generations and current generations by making loss and damage a priority. And part of that is really taking initiative to open that new finance facility or window for loss and damage and to pledge finance to fund that window. So I said in the open letter, an initial finance of 10 billion and rising with each year depending on whatever country's fair share of the contribution to the climate crisis and depending on the need of developing countries. To make loss and damage decision making inclusive to people, including young people, including people from the global south, including communities that are most affected by climate change, really bringing them to the table when you're making decisions. And finally, to have a meeting with Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. So this is specifically in our U.S. open letter, but I think to any governments that are interested in taking action on loss and damage, we would be open to meeting with them to have a discussion. And Ineza, do you want to come back in?
Yeah. I'm sorry for what happened. I was like,
that's okay. It's okay.
Thank you, Sadie. So on what we can do, so as the issue is huge and complex and extremely important, we need all hands on this. So we can first start by monitoring and communicating the loss and damage issue in our community, but also working with peers and community leaders to increase the loss and damage knowledge, because that gap is really extreme, because once people don't understand what they're dealing with, it kind of doesn't facilitate the adaptation or responsive mechanism. So we want to we can spread the loss and damage knowledge, and also we can do it by joining a local initiative aiming to respond to climate issue. This can be like local restoration or protection of wildfire, any activity that is in that scenario. And also we can join our voice to address the politician by pressuring them to really recognize that the climate the climate issue is way beyond political parties or political ambition. It's not a political issue. It's like a global call of action. It's like something that needs to be done. And also, the last but not least, we can collectively join our global day of action. So next slide, please. So the Global Day of Action is an initiative for the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition that will take place on the 18th of April. We aim to publish, if I can say that word, or like spread the word and show our open letter to the USA government in terms of what are our priorities in terms of climate action, but most importantly, loss and damage. We want also to hold an online or physical, depending on the location activity, and also we want to write stories in order to bring the story of. So basically, it's like for example, if we are doing a global day of action in Rwanda, and then we have like a youth who can write a story, then we can write a story and then publish it by sending it to the USA embassy in Rwanda, but also trying to do that in the form of a momentum so that it can be being operated in different countries where our members are located. That's a brief summary, but if there's something I missed or didn't say clearly, please, you can jump in at any point.
For me, it's clear. I would just add the purpose of the day is to really link what's happening in terms of loss and damage all over the world with kind of the U.S. responsibility, like as one of the largest historical polluter, and really make that like global connection between what's happening in each country and the responsibilities of developed nations. So yeah, sorry, I'll let you continue.
So the main takeaways, I think, did I skip something? Or am I done doing the main takeaways?
Oh, yeah, if you want, I can recap it. So essentially this very bright slide is about is just circling back on what we talked about today. So loss and damage refers to the harms caused by climate change, can be economic, non-economic, and it can also be immediate or slow onset. It's central to Article 8 of the Paris Agreement and is the focus of the Warsaw International Mechanism within the UN climate negotiations. And the COP26 is the opportunity to concretize ambitious action on L&D and develop a window of finance. Yeah, and you can help by joining LDYC. I mean, I think you've probably heard of it because you're already part of it, but sharing knowledge in your community and getting involved in local efforts to address loss and damage. Great. So yeah, actually, so we have some discussion questions. I actually wanted to start with questions themselves. If anyone has questions on what we presented on, or any like brief feedback, because this is our first time running the training, and yeah, we appreciate your views and opinions on it.
When loss and damage funds are being created or being discussed to be created, like you were talking about the Green Climate Fund and the Santiago loss and damage, what factors do they take into account? Is it historical? Is it fair shares? Is it purely the impacts? And are there tensions in even, like, what are the tensions in even the factors that are being considered to calculate loss and damage?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. Like, I think there's two sides of it, right? Like, it's what is the need, and then what are the resources available, and where do they come from, and who provides how much. So in terms of the need, and the big tricky thing, I mean, with anything climate related, it's always going to be estimates, because you can't, like, it would be much clearer if you could just see the processes happening, like, a bit more explicitly. But so in terms of calculating the need, I mean, there's some ways to estimate economic damage. I don't think it will ever be able to capture non-economic damages, and I think there's different arguments around like how far that should go. I personally am supporter of, like, reparations. Like, I think we should be proactively giving money to people who are likely to be affected by climate change, in a way to, like, rectify or past wrongs. I think realistically, a lot of, like, countries just want the money to, like, bring their GDP back after a disaster. So, but it's true actually that there's no good accounting mechanism right now for calculating loss and damages. The insurance industry is maybe the best attuned to these issues, and developing a mechanism for effectively recording the cost and other considerations, governance issues around loss and damage is going to hopefully come out of the Santiago network. The second issue being that of where the resources come from, who pays and how much. Right now, the UN climate finance system works on a basis of common but differentiated responsibility, which is like this principle that everybody has some role to play, but those which have contributed the most must contribute the most to solving climate change. And there's this also bit of respective capacity. So the countries which have the most resources should help those which have the least resources. Taking into account historical pollution is part of it. And current pollution also depends on, for example, China China's the biggest polluter now, but they also have the biggest population. So, so if you look at per capita, the U.S. is still majorly outsized polluter. I mean, I think a fair share. So first you determine the need, and then you split that need between the countries which have the capacity to pay based on a fair shares calculation, which does incorporate historical responsibility. And so fair shares would be like looking at how much a country is polluting now, how much a country has historically polluted, as well as, like, the capacity of the country to actually provide finance. And that is, pollution is correlated with economic success and money. And then, there's actually lots more on the finance issue that we could do a whole workshop on. A lot of people have suggested alternative mechanisms for finding the money because it's so much money. One is taxing fossil fuel companies, taxes on frequent flying, shipping taxes, any kind of, like, solidarity funds, financial transactions tax, billionaires tax, all of these different ideas that could potentially raise additional funding. But we do commit to the fact that it's important for the governments themselves to be providing some finance, because they are the ones who ultimately delayed on climate action. So that was a long answer, but does someone else want to take a question from Abdul on how we are going to operate when it comes to preventing loss and damage?
Um, it's a, it's a broad question. Would you mind restating it or clarifying what you mean by operate? As in how we're going to prevent or how we're going to adapt?
Okay, you know, in a country like mine, natural disasters don't happen often. So do we have this ability to know whether it will be natural disasters or not in a country? And when it comes to prevent, I don't know if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, like it's like preventing is like it's like essentially making it so that we know when we know a climate impact is coming, we can stop it from leading to loss and damage. Like when you know that a hazard's coming, it doesn't, like loss and damage itself isn't inevitable if you take the proper mechanisms to prevent. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, that is it.
I guess I should also highlight that even if your country doesn't experience like natural disasters very frequently, you very likely will still be affected by those slow onset problems, such as if you're a coastal country, for instance, there will be sea level rise or desertification from the other side. We're all surrounded to an extent, unfortunately, by the impacts, the slow onset impacts of loss and damage. So the only way to really cure that is more aggressive climate action today and adaptation, well, mitigation, more importantly, adaptation probably at this point.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that, there's like kind of a spectrum of, I wanted to do a slide on this. So many ideas in my head don't make it to the execution. So like, there's a spectrum between, like say, disaster response over here, where like a disaster has already happened, and that's what I'm, we're going on boats through flooded streets trying to bring people food, and on the other end here, there's like making sure that people live in houses where the roof won't blow off when there's a hurricane. So that kind of preventative action is adaptation. It's also loss and damage prevention, and then there's a lot of stuff that comes in between, such as those early warning systems, such as providing people a direct cash transfer 24 hours before a storm is going to hit, so that they can go and buy food rather than having to receive a packet of food from the World Food Program, which is going to be less effective anyway. And so there's a lot of things. And then on the other side, most of the people who die in a disaster don't die when the disaster hits. They die after, because they're unable to provide for their families, because there's disease in the water, because they've lost their access to food and their access to work. So recovery is the other bit of that spectrum, where you're helping people as soon as a disaster hits, like build that resilience so they can kind of bounce back and be able to provide for their family. So so there's a lot that we can do. This is the job ideally of governments, but a lot of governments don't have the capacity to do that, because they don't have the finance, because they don't have the governance systems. So that's what we're trying to build. We don't have that much time left. We were going to do some Q&A, but we've kind of, I think I've rambled too much on my answers. Yeah, actually, maybe what we can do is send along in the chat some of those links to our signups, and also do a quick checkout. Oh yeah, no, go ahead with your other question.
Okay. With loss and damage finance and how it's calculated, is it only based on emissions? Is it also material? Is it also resource use? How much is it connected to perhaps ecological damage as well? And how connected are those two? And that's just coming from the understanding that IPCC and the IPBES often operate in silo, and there's still this kind of merging going on of combining biodiversity damage as well as ecological extraction and and carbon emissions.
Yeah, at this point, fair shares is calculated almost exclusively from emissions, and it doesn't capture those secondary, and it also doesn't capture like the impact of colonialism. So I think there's definitely some. I mean, there's like a call from the justice community and from us, like, but within the Warsaw International Mechanism, for example, I honestly feel like they've been talking themselves in circles so much that they haven't had a deeper consideration of like some of these issues in a way that like is actual justice. So I don't know if you ever want to do a master's thesis. It's a good thing to think about. Did you say you've already done it?
No, I said I can't afford one.
I can't afford one. Neither can I. Cool. So, yeah, no, that's a really good question. I honestly think there's so much room to like be expanding the debate, and that's why I want to create so many loss and damage experts that like we can be the people who are like forcing everyone to think of these things. Any other questions? Thank you, Ineza, for dropping those links in the chat. Oh yeah, there's a report from our friends over at
Sure.
Cool. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming because, yeah, it's a growing journey for all of us to be running our first training. Thank you so much to our presenters. And if everybody, I know we're like a little over time, if everybody wants to write in the chat just like a couple of words on how they're feeling, or what they learned or what their takeaways are, and then we can say goodbye. That'd be great. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. I so appreciate your attendance today and hope you have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.